Welcome to another episode of Raven Conversations. I'm Joe C. Mandel, State Public Affairs Officer for the Washington National Guard. And today I'm joined by Steve Vuleta. He's the exec over at the Washington Air National Guard headquarters. He's here to talk to us about his career, which started in the Naval Academy and in the Marine Corps. And now you're a member of the Washington National Guard and kind of share his path to becoming a guardsman. So appreciate you joining us, Steve.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Joe. Really appreciate everything you've put together here with Raven Conversations. Big fan, by the way.
No, I appreciate that. So intro and background on yourself real quick.
Sure. So I'm Washington native. Grew up in Puyallup. I was born in Madigan, actually. So this is my home stomping grounds. Grew up here. Went to high school at Rogers High School. As you said, went to college at the Naval Academy. Commissioned in the Marine Corps. I was a NFO, Naval Flight Officer, what the Air Force calls Combat Systems Officer for an EA-6B Prowler, which no longer flies. Was a really fun job. Really enjoyed it. Really great community. Great group of folks in that community. And got off active duty in 2015. Decided I was kind of, I don't think the military has any use for me anymore. So I decided to go back to business school, got my MBA. My wife and I moved back here. We'd been crisscrossing the country, several years, PCS moves, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so it was time to kind of just move on to the next stage in life. And we settled up here, and I kind of thought, I kind of miss the military. I could do 1 week in a month and, 2 weeks a year, sure. And so I reached out to the Guard and actually the ASOG, Air Support Operations Group, Colonel Stilley over there, and at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Garfield, who was still Major Garfield at the time at the 111th ASOS. They responded to my inquiry, and they were like, "Hey, let's meet up and talk." And it sounds like you have an interesting background. They brought me on board. I assisted the Guard in October of 2018, and it's kind of been, I worked in industry for a while, and it's really been a blessing to be in the Guard because I don't think I would have ever. 5 years ago, you would ask me, "Hey, Steve, what are you going to be doing in the Guard?" I'd be like, "Well, I'd probably still just be doing, 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, maybe doing exercise here or there." The fact that I'm sitting up at Air Headquarters as the executive officer right now, working directly with the Director of Staff, Colonel Wenzel, Brigadier General Welsh, working with, you folks over at JFHQ, it's just amazing. The opportunities in the Guard have been amazing, and I'm really blessed to have these opportunities. So
I appreciate the kind words about the podcast.
Yeah,
I appreciate working with you, Steve. As always, I always like to ask the question. I think everybody always has a unique answer. How'd you learn about the Guard?
So I've always known about the Guard to some degree. My dad was actually Army, which adds a little bit of family drama to my own career decisions, especially early on. But he retired at Fort Lewis, which is why we kind of settled in this area. And he always mentioned, hey, National Guard and reserves. And when I was still active duty in the Marine Corps, he was like, he's like, hey, have you thought about going to reserves as, when you get out, you can get the retirement benefits, things of that nature. And I kind of thought about it. And I'm like, I don't know. I kind of, when I cut ties, I want to kind of just be done with it. Famous last words, right?
Yeah.
But I've always kind of known about it, and I never really knew just to what degree the Guard is a major player in, say, our national defense strategy, for example, especially seeing it at the headquarters level right now. I mean, you have Brigadier General Welsh out there meeting with General Alvin, the Air Force Chief of Staff, this past week, escorting the Royal Thai Air Force Commander-in-Chief on a geo escort mission, along with his spouse and the Thai Chief's spouse. I mean, people kind of underestimate, mostly because they don't know about just the level of involvement that the Guard has in the national defense strategy and overall with our state partnership program and programs of that nature. So I kind of thought, you think of the stereotype of the Guard when you're active, the weekend warriors. It's like, well, it's not your dad's Guard. And even my dad kind of knew this back when I was still on active duty. He's like, well, take a look at some of the deployments they do. And I actually met a few Guard members when I was overseas in Afghanistan, Army and Air. And I'm hearing some of the things they were doing. I mean, they're going to Europe. Heck, we sent a few folks from from the ASOG over there every year. They're doing trips to Southeast Asia. And I'm just like, wow, the Guard does a lot. And that kind of planted a seed in my head so that 3 years after I got off active duty, hey, let's check out the Guard and see what they have. And if I can be any of use to them, then that would be awesome. So
Yeah. So I kind of pointed out as we were talking, you've got guardsmen that have gone to West Point, you've got guardsmen that have gone to the U.S. Air Force Academy, Naval Academy, though. So kind of talking about that.
So I'm not sure how much of it was really a kind of, I really want the Naval Academy, and how much of it was, I need to show Dad I'm different because he was Army. I think it was a little bit of both. I did work really hard to apply to the Naval Academy because it's a very, very convoluted process, not usually not your typical college application process. And so that was pretty involved. My dad's advice was, okay, I want you to go to college. You want to do this thing. you need to figure it out. I'll assist where you can, but this is kind of Greek to me. My dad was a high school dropout. He got his GED. He went to Vietnam, stayed in the Army until he retired. And he's like, hey, I'm proud that you want to go to college. That's a good thing. But the Naval Academy, I don't know much about how to apply to a service academy, so it kind of left it up to me. And honestly, there was a lot of work, and it was kind of like, hey, I need to prove that I can do this. But I was a little surprised they actually let me in, and I kind of still am to some degree, and I don't know whether that's, you hear about imposter syndrome, but I'm not gonna lie, there are times I do feel like an imposter, and that continues to stay with me today. And I think in a way it's kind of good because it hopefully keeps me more humble than I otherwise would be. But I mean, at the time it was kind of like, oh wow, I actually got in. Okay, now what?
Yeah.
And so, when I went there and I was, surrounded by all these kind of top performing people from high schools and from the enlisted ranks who had also come into the academy. And I was like, wow, this is, I felt a bit out of my element. I'm not gonna lie. I'd say I was about an average midshipman, what they call the cadets there, midshipman. On my good days, I was probably average. And when I decided I wanted to go in the Marine Corps relatively early on, I did the training pipeline for that. They had a program somewhere between your junior and senior year that they send you down to Quantico for about a month or so and kind of assess you in there, evaluate you, decide whether or not you're Marine Corps officer material. And, they came out and they gave me a recommended for commission in the Marine. I was like, oh, okay. I honestly, I wasn't failing anything, but I didn't really feel like I was at the top of the pack either. I was kind of like, wow, they actually recommended me for this, and leadership thinks I can do this. And I started getting more confident at that point, and that's kind of what led me to compete for commission in the Marine Corps and get that. And once again, very blessed to have that opportunity, and very blessed to still keep in touch with a lot of the folks I was in the Marine Corps with while I was in it for just over 9 years. And it's kind of funny because I meet Marines both on the Army Air side here who had prior service, and immediately it's like, hey, November 10th, Ton Tavern, Archibald Henderson, all these things I'm throwing at you that you probably don't understand, but you say it to a Marine, they're like, yes, Grand Old Man of the Marine Corps. I know exactly what you're talking about.
So talk about that time at Annapolis. We always hear about people from, that went to West Point and they brag about it. Kind of talk about your time there.
I think if you've heard one academy, you've kind of heard them all. It's the differences are kind of more, they're a bit more subtle because everyone's first year just sucks, frankly. It's just you endure it, you get through it. They call it plebe year at West Point and Annapolis. They call it the dually year at the Air Force Academy. It's just, I don't want to say it's a haze-X, but it is basically just, you see the full gamut of leadership, I think, because you're outnumbered 3-1 by upperclassmen. And I think probably the most useful thing for me was I saw the absolute worst examples, I saw the absolute best examples, and I saw everything in between. And so that kind of helped build my kit for, what works, what doesn't work, what do I respond to, what do I not respond to, what is everybody else responding to. And so that kind of keyed in early on that, hey, I see what this guy's doing, it's not really working. I see what this gal's doing, she's really got it on the ball, I want to be more like her. And that kind of helped build my own leadership kit bag, if you will. I think everybody has their own way of doing that. And whether you were prior enlisted and you went to basic training boot camp, whether you commissioned through ROTC or OCS, OTS, or whether you went to a service academy, everybody brings that kind of perspective based on their own, what they've learned through their own path. And you have folks who've been in private industry for a decade and they decide they want to go into the Guard. Mm-hmm. And, maybe they have a degree, maybe they don't. So maybe they commission or enlist. And they bring a certain perspective too, based on what they've learned in private industry. And I think the most important thing for me was, honestly, I actually came out of my first year there feeling pretty humbled. And over the next 3 years, I was kind of reinforced because, once again, surrounded by a lot of people from different walks of life who were relatively successful up to that point. I kind of thought, I need to, take stock of where everybody else is and their perspectives and their opinions, and not be blinded by the fact that, oh, I went to Annapolis, or, oh, I went to the academy, therefore, right? It's like, well, not really, dude. Yeah. It depends. You get good leaders from all walks of life. That's the path I took. I'm grateful I took it. It gave me a really good experience and a really good way of looking at things. But it's not any less valid or any less applicable than anybody else's, honestly, if you really come down to it. And the great thing about the Guard, once again, is you have a very diverse swath of experience, whether how they went through basic training boot camp when they were enlisted, how they commissioned, what commissioning source they went through. And then you got the private industry layer on top of that, or public sector civilians layer on top of that. Anyone who's working out in the civilian world, which is 70% of the Guard membership, like they're bringing perspectives in from the outside all the time. So for me, it's it all kind of comes back to, the Guard is a very interesting laboratory of leadership in many ways. So.
Yeah. That's a very valid point. I mean, I was a prior enlisted who ended up going ROTC after a deployment, and now going through the ranks on the Army side. So Marine Corps, 9 years. Kind of talk about your experience in the Corps and where that kind of took you.
I think the best thing about, in my opinion, about the Marine Corps was when, like, you have Bullock in the Army. Bullock is branch specific, though, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. The Marine Corps, we have a form of Bullock called the basic school, but it's not branch specific. It's every you don't even know where your MOS is unless you're an air contract before you go there. Air contracts are different because they were always hurting for aviators in the Marine Corps, at least they were back in 2006. So, if you passed your aviation selection testing battery test and you were assessed as physically qualified, they were like, okay, we'll give you a slot to Pensacola. Not guaranteeing you pass flight school, but you can go to flight school and we'll see how you do there. Every other ground MOS, they compete at the basic school. They compete at their Bullock, essentially, for their MOS. And so I like that, again, it gives every officer in the Marine Corps kind of a level playing ground. Much like boot camp on the enlisted side is kind of the entry-level playing ground for every Marine, whether you're going to be an aviation operations specialist, a supply Marine, or whether you're going to be a grunt. Like, everyone's kind of getting that same baseline. And so I really enjoyed the fact that I got to hang out with guys who were going to be infantry officers, guys who were going to be logistics officers, gals who were going to be, combat engineers, that kind of thing. And I got to see where they were coming from. And it's kind of emphasized throughout the services. And I won't go so far as to say it's, the way every service should be. But what I did really like about it is, like, for our PME, Captain's PME, our Captain's Career Course equivalent is Expeditionary Warfare School. I did the 2-year distance education version, and we had, 2 days a week. We do seminars. I was in Coronado at the time, so we did them up at MCRD San Diego. And so you get in-person instruction, and then you have your Blackboard quizzes and papers that you'd submit and things like that. But the in-person, like, once again, EWS wasn't branch specific. It's all of a sudden I'm talking to a JAG, an S1, combat engineer. My study buddy was a combat engineer. I was an aviator. He showed me how to do a MACU for obstacles, and I showed him how to do an air infill plan. And the thing is, early on, like, you do your papers and quiz and the exercises, and they're like, "Hey, Vuleta, you're aviation, so you're going to be playing the role of the ACE, the air component element right now." And then, "Hey, you're a grunt, so you're the maneuver element. You're a battalion commander for this. You do this big sand table exercise or tactical exercise." And then by the end, all of a sudden, they're like, "Who's the JAG? You're the JAG. Okay, you're now the battalion commander." And they're switching everybody up, so everyone's getting this perspective of what every other person's doing and every other element, which I think is really good. And I think we do that to a large extent, especially kind of at our level. The thing about the Marine Corps, though, is they're doing it from day one. And from day one, it's like, if I'm flying in that cockpit, it's like my mind is, those guys are down in the fighting holes down there, and they're getting shot at. And then, they haven't had a resupply for, almost a week. So they're getting low on food and stuff. And so my mindset is always there, because I think back to, TBS is a training environment. It's pretty benign. It still wasn't comfortable. So I can only imagine what those guys are dealing with when they're actually getting shot at, and they're dealing with, hey, is resupply going to come? Is air support going to come in? Questions like that. So I think it kind of just sends home the point that, hey, we're all on the same team, and we're all trying to ensure that Joe gets taken care of, or we're trying to get the mission done. So that's one thing I really liked about my time in the Marine Corps, is how it emphasized kind of the every Marine concept, every man, every woman, we're all on the same page.
Yeah. So 2018, came over to the Washington Air National Guard. You mentioned 111th ASOS, 116th ASOS, both historical units in the Air National Guard. What was that first kind of just drill like when you walked in the door and you're like, this is the Air National Guard?
So I didn't have a uniform yet. So, because once again, all my uniforms were Marine Corps uniforms, and I walked in civvies, and they're like, "Oh, it's fine. We'll get your uniform issued and whatnot." And I was actually kind of taken by how similar it was to my experience. And part of it is having been an EA-6B Prowler air crew, we worked a lot with joint forces. And so when I was in Afghanistan, we'd support Army or NATO or JSOC, and you would work with controllers from different services, different countries. So to a large extent, a lot of the lingo was kind of very similar. Some of it was different, but it was similar enough to where doctrinally I knew that they were talking about, like, I was in the 111th ASOS. We had the Air Support Operations Center, the ASOC. I'm like, oh, that's right. Our manual says that's DAS, Direct Air Support Center in the Marine Corps. So it's basically functionally the same, It's like, and I hear, hey, we have we can put an airborne ASOC up in the air. It's like, oh yeah, the Marine Corps does that with the C-130 with airborne DAS. Very similar concepts. And heck, they even talk about Anglico in the ASOC, which I was like, wow, okay, this is very joint. And of course, ASOCs work with the Army a lot. So there's a lot, 5-paragraph orders, Annex D, fires. I'm like, oh, a lot of stuff is actually transferred over really, really, really well. And so that was kind of like the most surprising thing was actually that it wasn't quite as surprising as I thought it might be. Obviously, when it comes to Air Force systems, decorations, the A1 stuff, admin, that's a whole different beast because every service has their own silo with that and how they do things. But tactically speaking, I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by how similar it was and how easy it was kind of to integrate into that environment. And within a few drills, they got me to ASOC IQC, did a couple war fighters, and all of a sudden it was like, this feels normal.
Yeah. And so in 2020, you had a pretty important job working during the COVID call up, helping the food banks on this side of the state. Just describe how getting into that mission and what that was like.
So I was working, I was still DSG, M-Day, drilling 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, working a civilian job. Truth be told, I was kind of looking to exit that job. So when I was asked by Colonel Silly if I wanted to come on orders for 60 days, 90 days, COVID will blow over by 90 days, so probably 90 days. I was like, yeah, sure, that'll give me some time to figure things out, and I'll tender my resignation at this company because I'm kind of seeing no real growth here. I can move on to another company, and of course, 90 days turned into over a year, and when I first showed up, they're like, okay, you're gonna be in charge of a food bank in Tacoma. Okay, cool, and then the officer they had kind of running the food banks in Pierce County got pulled up to JFHQ, and they're like, who's the next senior officer? I was still a captain at the time. It's like, that captain over there. It's like, oh, okay. It's like, okay, now you're in charge of all 7 food banks on the west side. I was like, oh, okay, let's figure this out. And luckily I knew a lot of the airmen that were kind of in the Air Force component of that. So it was easy to find, I knew the NCOs, we had a good rapport. We got to know the folks we didn't know really quickly, got operations distributed, and we started working right away. I got to know my Army counterparts who were working the Army food banks at the time before we consolidated everything. But as you know, it kept growing and growing, and soon we had basically a 700-person task force on the west side. And I think we actually went over 800 briefly, but Lieutenant Colonel Hobbs became the task force commander for food bank support on the west side. I became his deputy, his XO, and honestly, it was for all the craziness of 2020, that was probably one of the most rewarding things I've done, because not only did it feel personally rewarding to support our community, our state. Once again, born in Madigan, this is my home. But I got to know folks like you. I got to know folks both on the Army and Air side and the State Guard. Mm-hmm. I got to know all the leadership that I got to interact with. I got to meet Colonel McMahon. I got to meet General Grennan. I got to meet Colonel Wenzel, who I now work for over at HQ. So all these relationships that were built kind of in the crucible, for lack of a better term, of 2020 are suddenly people I see, and I'm like, hey, sir, ma'am, or hey, first sergeant. Like, I see them, and they know me, and it's like we have these relationships from having gone through that together, and it's honestly it's been a real blessing. So many people I could think of that kind of came out of me coming on full time that I still keep in touch with today. Once again, I mean, yourself, Colonel Durda, when she was still at the J3, Colonel Gentry, who's now the J3 on the green side, General Welsh, Colonel Berggren, who's now the 194th Wing Commander. And then, looking kind of more at my peer group, I mean, Sean Oliveira, he was our S3, yep. Captain Oliveira, Captain Stefanik. She was, we brought her back up to JFHQ to help us out with some of the A1, J1 stuff. When we had to basically stand up again for that mission last winter, spring, the Department of Corrections and DVA mission. So you have a lot of really fantastic people out there, and from my perspective, it's like, use these people. They're assets. I'm very impressed by the level of talent and the level of drive of many Guard members, both officer and enlisted. And I think sometimes they get overlooked, and I'm kind of an introverted guy myself, so I know what that's like. I kind of like to do my job and just I don't like seeking credit or anything for it. But as an officer, as a senior NCO, I think it's incumbent upon us to lean in and, hey, you've been working on this a long time. You seem to really know your stuff. Do you want more responsibility? Like, I think that's kind of coming upon us to ensure that those people are kind of brought forward and given those opportunities. And I think generally speaking, we've done a pretty good job. But we can always do better. So kind of a long answer to your question.
No, that's a perfect answer for the question. And then, so you went full time just last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the Air Guard headquarters.
Yeah.
And now you're back, you're with headquarters, and it's fantastic to work with you. I like to ask this question, I think, to anybody, any advice you'd give to younger guardsmen out there who are trying to make their way through, or any young military member in general?
I'm leery of advice only because I think I always seek advice. I'm leery of giving it because I like to know a person's station and what the context of their current situation, mostly professional, but also personal to an extent, because people make decisions based on both. But if there's anything I would say, I'd say seek out the opportunities. There are people out here. There are key leaders in key positions right now who are looking for people to take on challenges and to take on opportunities. And if you're someone who has drive and you're someone who wants to lean into that, be kind of a spring bud. And it's hard for me as an introverted person to say that, but I say this as a fellow introvert. Like sometimes, hey, sir, ma'am, first sergeant, like I'd like to, take the lead on this. Okay. I'm always looking for people who want to not just better themselves, better the organization. And having kind of been, I won't get too much into it, but having kind of felt, in a past life, 10, 15 years ago, what it's like to kind of be overlooked, I know that that's something that some Guard members deal with. And I know that that's something that they feel, and they want recognition that in many cases I believe is due, but just hasn't been brought to the forefront yet. And that kind of goes back to my previous point where I think anybody who's wearing one of these pieces of flair that officers wear or stripes as an NCO needs to lean in and really put their ear to the ground with their people. The people who are the kind of the extroverted, typical leaders, hey, they're easy to identify. We can get them what they need. We can get them the opportunities they've earned. That's the easy part. But it kind of goes back to one of the things my dad used to tell me, which is, I'm like, I remember when I was, first commissioned in the Marine Corps and we were driving, I was on leave, he was driving me home from SeaTac, and he said, how are things going? I'm like, well, I'm trying to figure out how to take my time, which is finite, and divide it among my people. Because I have, top performers, but I have people who, need a little bit of help, or maybe are good performers, but just aren't the types of people that jump up and take credit. And my dad was not one to mince words. He just looks at me and he says, you need every single one of those troops to be 100% effective at all times. That's your goal. And I'm like, well, and me being my whiny 25-year-old self was like, yeah, but I don't have What rank are you? Well, I'm just lieutenant. No, you're an officer. Figure it out. But I was a sergeant major, in case you couldn't tell. So, yeah. So I was like, okay. And and he knew, of course, obviously time is finite and you only have so much time you can give your people. But the ideal is that as an officer, and the burden in a lot of ways as an officer, as an NCO, is that you need to be getting as close to that 100% as you can. Because I know his mindset was Vietnam. He did 3 deployments, 3 year-long tours in Vietnam as a grunt. And his mindset was very much like, my top guy gets shot and I'm, okay, now what? There's a great book by Nate Fick, called One Bullet Away, about 1st Recon Battalion in OIF-1. And the one bullet away is like, I'm one bullet away from taking my boss's job. So his mindset was very much like, yeah, okay, maybe so-and-so is not your best performer, but you need to be putting time into so-and-so as well. And that might be hard sometimes, but if he's the last guy you got and you're in a situation where you need someone to step up, you're going to want to know that he at least knows enough to not only get by, but maybe he might need to take the lead. Mm-hmm. So in his own colorful way, it was his way of saying, hey, it's a privilege to serve. It's a privilege to be an officer. That privilege comes with a cost. The privilege of being an NCO comes with a cost. I know that weighed on him heavily his whole life. So I would say if you have the time now, when, as we say in the Air Force, ground speed 0, take the time to invest in your people. Once again, the folks who are kind of your typical A performers, hey, those are the easy ones. We know where they're going. Take the time to find those who are maybe flying under the radar a little bit. Maybe those who are good, but maybe need to be a bit more vocal about it. And the ones who maybe aren't so good, but maybe they need a little bit of coaching, or maybe they need a little kick in the pants, or maybe both. But the goal should be to get everybody to that level where they can perform. So.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic advice, and I think great leadership advice for anybody in general, whether they're an NCO or an officer, or even a warrant officer. I think that's just fantastic advice. Anything else you want to add? Or?
Nah, just great to be here, Joe. Really appreciate everything you guys have put on here, and big supporter of Raven Conversations. We'll continue to be a big supporter, and I probably won't watch this because I don't like watching myself, but I will continue to watch everybody else's.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Steve. I've gotten to know you over the last few years. It's fantastic. I like to call you a friend, and I think it's going to be great to work with you over these few years still. And I'm glad you're where you're at now. So if you like the video, make sure to give it a like. If you have a comment or have a question, make sure to put it in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for future videos. Steve, we appreciate it, man.
Hey, no worries. Thanks for having me on.